Today I'll be giving my SRP presentation on how page color affects reading speed. Before getting into the research, allow me to introduce myself. I'm James Hall. I attend Gretna High School, and in the fall of 2023 I'll be attending Virginia Tech, where I wish to major in mechanical engineering. I chose this project because visual disabilities run in my family, and I personally wish to help people who want to read but who are restricted by visual disability. The findings of the study could provide a possible remedy to the effect that disability has on how a person reads. The findings of the study could also prove useful in an educational setting if an increase in reading speed is found with a particular color, which could lead to the use of that color to help students with slower reading speeds. Before I could begin conducting my experiment, I had to conduct a literature review by researching the field and acquiring background knowledge so that I could understand how to conduct my experiment. A few major topics were common within my literature review, those being background contrast, which is the contrast between the background and the letters of the text, the difference between reading from a digital screen and reading text from a physical print, and how color and intensity of background affected reading, with the gap being little to no information about how teenagers were affected. Background contrast is an important factor in how text is perceived and the speed in which it is read. Contrast affects how the eyes detect the stimulus because the eyes use the difference of shades between an object and its background to create perspective, which allows the eyes to perceive depth. This is important in reading because without contrast between the text and its background, the words would seem blurred and meshed together. Increased contrast was also found to remedy some of the adverse effects that age and visual disabilities have on reading speed, thus allowing those with visual impairments or cognitive disabilities to be able to read at a less abnormal rate. We as humans have mostly read from books in the past. However, since the invention of computers, reading from the screen has become increasingly prevalent in more than educational settings. Printed media provides a tactile experience for the reader, which helps many people connect with the text better and become more immersed in the reading process, thus leading to better comprehension. However, even though there's less information about the effects of digital media, there are some important factors that provide a case for their increased usage. For one, digital media are more portable now due to the compactness of e-readers and how easy it is to share files. Digital media are also more customizable now and can allow the reader to accommodate their preferences. The question of whether to use printed or digital media is more of a question of circumstance though, as it was found that in shorter reading periods of 30 minutes or less, printed media had a higher average reading speed than digital media, while also in longer reading periods, digital media provided a higher average reading rate, while also providing a higher contrast rate. Printed media, or paper color, can affect the way text is read by increasing or decreasing the reading rate. Combinations of text and background color can be used to increase reading performance and reduce the rate of error when reading. The correlation between background color and varied reading speed could be due to the change in contrast that a color provides, although more investigation is required to confirm this. However, since the combinations that produced high contrast levels or reading rates had higher contrast levels, which reinforces this hypothesis. A way to change the color of a medium other than using colored paper is to use a colored overlay. A colored overlay is a colored sheet of plastic that is transparent, thus allowing the reader to read the words while changing the color of the background. Colored overlays are commonly used to assist children with dyslexia, but require more research than those without to provide a further understanding of how they affect the perception of a text. Which leads me in my research question: how does paper color affect the reading speeds and words per minute of teenagers ages 14 through 18 compared to white parent paper? To answer my question, I had the first proposed hypotheses. My research hypothesis being that if I change the color of the paper used, then there will be a noticeable effect on the reading speed of teenagers ages 14 through 18, while my null hypothesis states that if I change the color of the paper used, then there will be no noticeable effect on the reading speed of teenagers ages 14 through 18. The variables of my experiment are as follows. My independent variable is the color of the paper used. My dependent variable is the reading speed associated with each paper color, while my control is using white parent paper, as is the standard. The items that need to be held constant for validity were the time limit for each reading task, the script used to brief the participants before testing, the text used for each color, the font, as well as the font size. First, I obtained consent from the Pittsylvania County School Superintendent, as well as gained informed consent from each of my 30 participants and their parent. Afterwards, I gathered my materials by ordering the colored and white paper and then obtained the text used on each reading task from a released reading test for high schoolers. Since each participant is performing the same task, I randomized the treatment by randomizing the order of the papers for each participant to ensure validity. Before we begin testing, the participants would sign in, and I briefed them on what they'd be doing during the research process, as seen in the first picture. In the testing portion, the participants would read from papers of varying color in a random order for 1 minute, and then they'd mark the point at which they stopped. This would then be repeated for each color until all 5 papers were read. Afterwards, I compiled the raw data in a spreadsheet and used a one-way ANOVA statistical analysis to analyze the data. The purpose of using a one-way ANOVA was to compare the means of several groups, as my experiment had 4 experimental groups of red, yellow, green, and blue paper that needed to be compared to my control group of white paper. At a significance level of 0.05, the ANOVA provided a p-value of 0.001. This provides enough statistical significance to reject the null hypothesis. In the graph, the mean shows the average increase or decrease in reading speed. The mean change in reading speed of the white paper was 0, which was because the white paper established the baseline reading speed for each reader. The mean change in reading speed for the red paper was positive 9.57 words per minute, which was the highest change, while also providing the largest variance of any group. This means that red paper had the largest range of reading speeds of any color tested. The mean change in reading speed for yellow paper was positive 9.23 words per minute, which was similar to red paper in average change in reading speed as well as variance. The mean change in reading speed for green paper was positive 0.6 words per minute, as well as 0.6 words per minute, which shows a slight increase in reading speed, but not one of notable difference when reading. The mean change in reading speed of the blue paper was negative 2.03 words per minute, while also having the lowest variance. This shows that the blue paper is much more consistent at lowering the reading speed of the readers than any of the other colors were at increasing the reading speed. With the rejection of the null hypothesis, my research hypothesis is supported. This shows that changing the color of a paper may have a significant effect on the reading speed of teenagers ages 14 through 18 at the 0.05 significance level. The outcome of my study implies a few things. The finding that red and yellow paper have a similar positive effect on reading speed could promote the increased usage of these colors for slower readers in a classroom and/or personal setting, which was consistent with Morse et al. In their experiment on how background color affects the self-correction rate of children. The opposite can be said of blue paper, since it decreased average reading speed and would thus remove itself as a candidate for supplemental treatment for slow reading speed. Another implication would be that since colors with longer wavelengths produce a higher average reading speed, and those of a lower wavelength produce a negligible increase or a decrease in reading speed, it's reasonable to assume that wavelength of color is a factor in the perception of a text. My study, like all others, was not immune to limitations. One limitation of my study that may have influenced my data is the lack of a priming task. A priming task would essentially act as a trial run for each participant and get them accustomed to reading before conducting the testing. The lack of a priming task could have caused some of the data points, to be lower than they should have been. Another limitation was the fact that I used a convenient sampling approach rather than a random sampling approach, which means that my data may not be representative of the entire population of teenagers. No, I'm just losing my voice. In future studies, the sampling of participants should be randomized, and the test sample size should be larger than 30 to ensure the results are representative of the population. Another area of future study would be research into how wavelength of color affects perception and reading performance. My findings show some correlation between reading speed and paper color in teenagers, which highlights an area for future study, which would be to determine how a developmental stage based on age influences the effectiveness of using colored paper to increase reading speed. Such studies would test adolescent age groups and compare them to incrementally older age groups. The research process has taught me many things, such as how to navigate through databases, how to present empirical information in the form of a professional paper, as well as before a group of people, and how to conduct professional research. Throughout the conduction of my research and experimentation, I've also developed a newfound respect for those who devote their time and energy in research. Now I would like to thank all the people who helped me throughout the research process. I'd like to thank all the adjudicators here tonight. I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Jones and Dr. Joshua Bocock for approving my study, Ms. Long for advising and guiding me through the research process, Ms. Dillon for advising me and guiding me through my through my experimentation, Ms. Gravett for advising me in my statistical analysis, Mr. Ireson and Mr. Clements for allowing me to use their classrooms to test participants, and finally my participants for allowing me to conduct my study. This concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
First of all, get you some water.
Thank you.
So, first question. Did you take into consideration color blindness?
Ms. Collins, sorry. Ms. Collins asked if I took into account color blindness. I did not, simply because of the fact that during the briefing, well, technically I did, but during the briefing of my participants, I asked if there were any confounding variables or any factors that may have influenced the data beforehand.
Next question. Your passages that they read, were they similar or the same?
So the passage, or Ms. Collins asked if the passages were similar or the same for each color. The passages were similar in terms of content, but each passage was different for each color of paper.
And the last question, I'm sorry, this was very interesting. So did you present the same color? I'm sorry, I missed that part. Did you present the color red, yellow, green, and blue every time in that order, or did you randomize that?
Ms. Collins asked, did I present them in the same order every time, or if I randomized it? I randomized the order, but each of the passages were used like on the same color for each paper tested.
Was this a between or within subjects design? Meaning, did each participant read every passage from the different colors of paper, or were there different groups for the different colors of paper?
Ms. Kent asked if there were different groups for each color of paper, or if they all performed the same task. So each participant acted as their own control group, so they all performed or were tested using the same material. So it wasn't different between participants.
If you were to change the color of the lettering, I assume you use black, your letters are black?
Yes.
Would that make a difference?
Dr. Jones asked if changing the color of the lettering would make a difference. So one of my studies in my literature review, I actually tested this and tested combinations of background color and different colored text. So yes, it would make a difference in the performance of reading.